A single sheet of parchment once held the power to move mountains and reshape continents. This is the forgotten story of 21 ancient treaties that carved our world into the map we know today. Agreements that shifted the fates of empires and then vanished from public memory. By the end of this journey, you will understand the hidden forces that drew the lines on our modern map. We will travel from the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the sealed letters of medieval Europe, uncovering why a peace treaty signed over 3,000 years ago still matters, and how a broken promise could spark a conflict centuries later. What does a border truly mean to you? A king's word was his bond, but that bond was forged in the fires of faith and fear. In the ancient world, a treaty was far more than a legal document. It was a sacred vow, sworn before gods and sealed with rituals that could include royal marriages, exchanges of gold and jewels, or solemn oaths that called down divine wrath upon any who broke them. This was a world without international courts or neutral observers. The power of an agreement rested entirely on the perceived strength of the ruler who made it and the deities he invoked as witnesses. The Greek historian Thucydides captured the brutal reality of these negotiations when he wrote that the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Every clause, every promise was a direct reflection of this raw power dynamic. A pharaoh did not negotiate with a minor chieftain as an equal. He dictated terms, and the resulting pact was an extension of his own divine mandate to rule. This is why the physical form of these treaties was so vital. They were not filed away in some dusty archive. They were carved into stone stelae for public display, inscribed on bronze tablets that would last for ages, or written on precious papyrus. The material itself sent a message of permanence and power, but time is the great enemy of history. A papyrus scroll can crumble to dust in a damp tomb. A bronze tablet might be melted down for weapons. A stone monument could be toppled and shattered by a conquering army. The survival or loss of these artifacts has profoundly shaped our understanding. We often have only one side of the story, a victory monument from the empire that won, with the voice of the defeated forever silenced. Interpreting the true intent behind the fragmented words is a constant challenge for historians. Was a phrase meant as a genuine promise of peace, or merely a temporary pause for a stronger power to catch its breath? Understanding this world of personal oaths and symbolic power is the essential key that unlocks the true significance of the treaties that would forever change the map. That sacred vow on a silver tablet was first made real in the dust and heat of the ancient Near East. Our journey starts with the Kadesh Peace Treaty, forged around 1259 before the Common Era. It stands as one of the oldest surviving peace treaties humanity has ever found. This was not an agreement between friends. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III had just fought a colossal, indecisive battle at the city of Kadesh. Their armies were exhausted, their treasuries drained, and neither empire could deliver a final, crushing blow. So they turned from the battlefield to the negotiating table. The result was a revolutionary document. It established a formal boundary between their spheres of influence in the Levant, the volatile region between them. More remarkably, it created a mutual defense pact. Each superpower pledged to come to the other's aid if a third party attacked, a stunning act of foresight that turned former enemies into strategic allies. The treaty's physical form was a message in itself. It was inscribed on tablets of silver, a metal more precious than gold in that era. One version was written in Egyptian hieroglyphics, the other in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the day. This was not a secret deal. It was meant to be seen, understood, and respected by all. The clauses within were incredibly sophisticated for their time. Scholars like Trevor Bryce point to provisions for the extradition of political refugees, a concept that feels remarkably modern. A nobleman who fled from one court to the other would be sent back, preventing internal dissent from destabilizing their new peace. The entire agreement was sworn before hundreds of gods and goddesses from both the Egyptian and Hittite pantheons. To break such an oath was to invite divine retribution, a risk no king would lightly take. The legacy of this single treaty was a century of stability. With the threat of war lifted, prosperity flowed along the border. Trade routes reopened, allowing goods and ideas to travel freely between Egypt and the Hittite lands in Anatolia. This era of cooperation fostered a cultural exchange that enriched both civilizations. And then the treaty was forgotten. The Hittite Empire collapsed, Egypt's power waned, and the silver tablets were lost, perhaps melted down. For over 3,000 years, the specifics of this groundbreaking peace were unknown. We only know its details today because archaeologists painstakingly pieced together copies that had been carved into temple walls in Egypt. The story of Kadesh reminds us that our historical knowledge is often a fragile reconstruction, a puzzle with most of its pieces missing. This first great treaty proved that even the most bitter rivals could draw a line and choose peace, a powerful idea that would next be tested in the crucible of Mesopotamia. Centuries before Kadesh, in the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, another ruler attempted to carve order from chaos. The Treaty of Mesilim, dating to around 2550 before the Common Era, is a staggering leap further back into the origins of diplomacy. This was not an agreement between vast empires, but a mediation. The powerful King Mesilim of Kish stepped in to settle a bitter dispute between two rival Sumerian city-states, Lagash and Umma. Their conflict was over a strip of land known as Gaidina, a name that translates to the edge of the plain. This was not just any land, it was exceptionally fertile territory, a prize worth fighting for in a world where agricultural wealth was power. The core of the conflict was one of the most enduring in human history, a fight over water and the rich soil it nourished. King Mesilim acted as a neutral arbitrator, a concept that feels remarkably advanced for its time. He did not conquer the feuding cities, he judged between them. His solution was to define a clear border, a line on the ground that would, in theory, end the fighting. This act of drawing a boundary was so significant that it was recorded for all to see on a stone monument called a stele. The language used on this stele, as noted by scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer, reveals a pivotal shift in human organization. It moves beyond simple tribal loyalty towards the idea of territorial sovereignty, the concept that a city-state's authority is tied to a defined piece of land, not just the people who live in it. This is one of the very first expressions of a border as we understand it today, a legal and political reality, not just a geographical one. The treaty did not just declare the border, it physically created it. The stele describes how the boundary was marked with ditches and inscribed stones, an ancient form of surveying that made the abstract agreement tangible. You could stand at the edge of Gaidina and see the line that divided one world from another, but this early experiment in diplomacy had a fatal flaw. The treaty was not strong enough to withstand human ambition. It was violated again and again, leading to cycles of war and renegotiation that stretched across generations. The stele of Mesilim itself became a political football, a symbol that each side claimed to support while repeatedly crossing the line it defined. The treaty ultimately faded from memory, buried under the sands as new empires rose over the ruins of Sumer. Yet its failure is as instructive as its creation. It shows that drawing a line is only the first step. The real challenge is making that line respected, a problem that would demand ever more sophisticated tools of statecraft. But that line in the sand was always vulnerable to the next conqueror. Centuries after the Sumerian disputes, a new kind of power emerged in Mesopotamia, one that would codify its dominance in a treaty of breathtaking scale and ambition. The so-called Eternal Treaty between the Assyrian Empire and Babylonia in the 7th century before the Common Era was anything but eternal. It was a desperate attempt to freeze a moment of overwhelming power into a permanent arrangement. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal imposed this agreement upon his own brother, Shamash-Shum-Ukin, who ruled Babylonia. This was not a pact between equals, but a family affair twisted into an instrument of imperial control. The treaty aimed to redefine the crucial border along the Tigris River, solidifying Assyria's hard-won dominance after years of conflict. It was a masterpiece of political theater, inscribed on cuneiform tablets that promised military support, generous trade privileges, and unshakable dynastic loyalty. On the surface, it painted a picture of two brother kings united in friendship for mutual benefit. But as historian Mario Liverani explains, this language of eternal friendship was a carefully crafted mask for raw imperial ambition. The true purpose was to bind Babylonia so tightly to Assyria that it could never again challenge its northern overlord. The most chilling parts of the treaty are its elaborate curses. The text calls upon the gods to unleash unimaginable horrors upon anyone who would dare violate its terms. It describes plagues, famine, and the complete obliteration of one's lineage. This was psychological warfare written into the very fabric of diplomacy, an attempt to deter betrayal through the sheer terror of divine retribution. The Assyrians understood that a promise sworn in fear could be as powerful as one sworn in good faith. Yet, for all its grand promises and terrifying curses, the Eternal Treaty failed spectacularly. The underlying tensions between the two powers, the resentment of Babylonian subjugation, proved stronger than any words on a clay tablet. Shamash-Shum-Ukin eventually led a massive rebellion against his own brother, a conflict that ended in the near-total destruction of Babylon itself. The treaty was forgotten, another broken promise in the long history of the region. Its dramatic failure forces a difficult question. If neither sacred oaths nor the threat of divine punishment could hold a border firm, what tool could an empire possibly use next? The answer would be found not in words but in stone and systematic organization. Across the Mediterranean, a different kind of border was being drawn, not in stone but in the water. The rivalry between the Greek city-state of Syracuse and the Carthaginian Empire turned the island of Sicily into a perpetual chessboard. Throughout the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, they signed a series of treaties that sliced the island into temporary spheres of influence. Each agreement was a snapshot of military power at a given moment, a line redrawn after every campaign. The historian Diodorus Siculus recorded how these pacts determined control over crucial ports, fertile plains, and entire populations. One treaty might grant Syracuse dominion over the eastern coast, while another would push the border eastward, handing key Greek cities over to Carthaginian authority. This was high-stakes diplomacy with immediate, tangible consequences. The clauses within these documents were remarkably specific, designed to manage the day-to-day realities of their Cold War. They restricted naval movements, limiting how many warships could sail in certain waters. They dictated tribute payments, transforming military defeat into economic obligation. They defined the status of allied cities, forcing smaller communities to choose a side or face annihilation. This created a delicate and constantly shifting balance of power. For a few years, or sometimes a few decades, the treaties would halt open warfare, allowing trade to resume and communities to breathe, but they never resolved the underlying rivalry. In fact, they often stored up future conflicts by creating resentments and grievances that would boil over when the balance of power shifted again. A city forced to pay tribute to Carthage one year would eagerly welcome a Syracusan army the next, seeing them as liberators. The local consequences of these forgotten agreements were profound. They dictated whether a child learned Greek or Punic, which gods were worshipped in the public square, and which trade networks brought prosperity or poverty. These treaties, now footnotes in most history books, actively sculpted Sicilian identity for centuries, layer by contested layer. Their gradual fade from our collective memory shows how regional pacts are often overshadowed by the grand narratives of Rome and Persia. Yet this relentless negotiation between two cultures, Greek and Punic, set the stage for an even more ambitious experiment in border making, one that would emerge from the conquests of a single man and reshape the entire known world. 500 war elephants were the price of peace between two worlds. In the wake of Alexander the Great's fractured empire, two new powers faced each other across the vast expanse of the Indus River. Seleucus I Nicator, a Macedonian general fighting to hold his Asian territories, and Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of a mighty Indian dynasty, met not on the battlefield but in negotiation. The treaty they forged around 303 before the Common Era was a masterpiece of practical statecraft. Seleucus ceded control of enormous territories in the Indus Valley, a humbling retreat from Alexander's dream of Eastern conquest. In return, he received something far more valuable for the wars he was fighting back in the West, a gift of 500 Indian war elephants. This was not a simple purchase, it was a strategic realignment that redrew the map of Asia. The classical historian Apamea recorded the deal, noting it also included a marriage alliance binding the two royal houses together. This was more than a border agreement. It was the creation of a new frontier, a permeable membrane between the Greek and Indian worlds. Scholar John D. Granger suggests this treaty was a rare moment of geopolitical clarity. Both empires pragmatically accepted their geographical and logistical limits. Seleucus could not afford a long war on his eastern flank while his rivals circled in Syria and Anatolia. Chandragupta Maurya secured his western border and gained immense prestige. The line they drew allowed both to turn inward and consolidate their vast core territories, avoiding generations of exhausting frontier conflict. The consequences rippled far beyond politics. Those 500 elephants did not simply vanish. Seleucus used them to decisive effect in his western wars, their massive forms crashing into battle lines as far away as Greece, shifting the balance of power among Alexander's successors. But the treaty's true, lasting legacy was cultural. The border became a bustling crossroads. Greek artists and travelers moved east, their styles influencing the earliest Buddhist statues in the Gandhara region, creating a unique fusion of realistic sculpture and spiritual subjects. Buddhist monks and ideas traveled west, carried along the same routes, planting the seeds of their philosophy in the Hellenistic world. This was a silent, profound exchange orchestrated by a single diplomatic act. And then the orchestrators were forgotten. As the Seleucid and Mauryan empires crumbled, the memory of their groundbreaking agreement faded, buried under the sands and the rise of new powers. The treaty itself was lost, known only through scattered fragments in Greek and Indian texts. Its story reveals that the most successful borders are not just walls to keep people out. They can also be bridges, allowing ideas to flow in both directions and reshape civilizations. This concept of a bridge, however, would be tested to its absolute limit by the next great empire, one that believed its borders were not merely lines on a map, but the very edge of the civilized world. Rome's rise to empire did not begin with a legion's march, but with a handshake. In the early days of the Republic, the young city was vulnerable, surrounded by rival Latin tribes and hill peoples. Survival demanded allies, not just armies. The result was the Foedus Cassianum, a treaty signed around 493 before the Common Era between Rome and the cities of the Latin League. This was not a conqueror's diktat, but a pact of mutual defense and shared citizenship. According to the historian Livy, its core principle was stunning for its era, an equal partnership. Rome and the Latins pledged to have neither peace nor war with any foreign power except by common consent. They would supply equal numbers of soldiers for any campaign and share the spoils of war equally. This agreement drew a defensive border around all of Latium, transforming a collection of squabbling towns into a single, formidable bloc. Legal historian Andrew Lintott highlights how this framework of collective security was Rome's masterstroke. It allowed the city to project power far beyond its walls without immediately annexing its neighbors, avoiding the resentment that outright conquest would have sparked. For generations, the treaty held. Roman and Latin soldiers fought side by side, their shared victories binding them together. But the very success of the arrangement contained the seeds of its own destruction. With every successful war, Rome grew stronger, its population and wealth eventually dwarfing that of its partners. The legal fiction of equality became impossible to maintain. The treaty, designed for balance, slowly became a cage for the Latins, who found themselves bound to a partner that no longer saw them as an equal. The Foedus Cassianum was eventually set aside, rendered obsolete by the very power it had helped to create. The Latin League was absorbed, its members granted a form of Roman citizenship, but their independence was gone. The border it had so carefully defined dissolved, becoming not the edge of an alliance, but simply the interior of a growing Roman state. We remember the legions and the emperors, but we forget this diplomatic foundation. The treaty's specifics were lost, overshadowed by the epic tales of conquest that followed. Yet its legacy was profound. It proved that a border could be a membrane, a zone of integration rather than division. It showed that influence could be grown through partnership as effectively as through the sword, a subtle art that Rome would master and then forget as its power became absolute. This early experiment in federal-style diplomacy raises a haunting question. Can any alliance between equals survive the success it creates? Or is the ultimate price of victory the partnership that made it possible? A Roman senator never set foot in Asia Minor, yet his signature carved its new borders. The Treaty of Apamea, imposed in 188 before the Common Era, was the ultimate long-distance declaration of power. Rome had shattered the Seleucid army at Magnesia, and the terms they dictated to King Antiochus III were not merely punitive, they were cartographic. Antiochus was forced to abandon every scrap of territory west of the Taurus Mountains. This was not a simple transfer of land to Rome. Instead, the Romans masterfully redrew the entire political map, elevating their local allies. The Kingdom of Pergamum and the island state of Rhodes were granted vast new territories, transforming them into powerful client states tasked with managing the region on Rome's behalf. The Roman Republic from across the sea had become the supreme architect of Anatolia's frontiers. The Greek historian Polybius recorded the crushing details. Antiochus had to pay a war indemnity of 15,000 talents, an almost unimaginable sum that would drain his treasury for years. He was forced to surrender all but a handful of his war elephants and to drastically reduce his navy. This was a deliberate strategy to cripple both his land and sea power, ensuring he could never again challenge Roman interests in the region. The treaty did more than just create borders, it enforced them by permanently weakening the only power capable of crossing them. As historian Erich S. Grun points out, the true genius of Apamea was its economic dimension. The massive indemnity payment was not just a punishment, it was a mechanism that forcibly integrated the Hellenistic East into Rome's financial orbit. Silver and gold flowed west, while Roman merchants gained unprecedented access to the rich markets of Asia Minor. The treaty forged economic networks that would bind the Mediterranean together for centuries, long after the political clauses were forgotten. The memory of Apamea itself, however, did fade. As Rome moved from indirect influence to direct provincial rule in the following century, this pivotal moment of diplomatic finesse was overshadowed by the brute force of later conquests. We remember the legions, but we forget the treaty that made their job easier. This raises a profound question about how empires manage their frontiers. Is it more effective to rule from a distance through proxies, or must every border eventually be held by a soldier's boot? The answer would be tested not in the Mediterranean, but in the deserts of the East, where a different empire faced a relentless nomadic threat and chose a startlingly different solution. The Kadesh Treaty was far more than a simple ceasefire. It established a sophisticated buffer zone, a neutral territory between the warring giants of Egypt and Hatti, where the rules of engagement were clearly defined. This was not an empty no-man's land. It was a carefully managed space where life and commerce could cautiously resume. The treaty's detailed clauses for the extradition of fugitives were not just about political dissent. They were a mechanism to prevent this buffer zone from becoming a lawless refuge for criminals and runaway slaves, ensuring that neither king's authority was undermined along their shared frontier. More importantly, it explicitly promised protection for merchants traveling between the two empires. This single provision turned a military border into an economic gateway, allowing goods like Anatolian silver and Egyptian gold to flow, enriching both realms and making peace far more profitable than war. Recent archaeological work, particularly by Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen, has peeled back another layer of this ancient diplomacy. He points to a cache of diplomatic letters exchanged between the courts of Pharaoh Ramesses and the Hittite king. These were not just polite greetings, they were active negotiations, adjustments to the original treaty made in response to new crises and opportunities. A dispute over a specific city-state's loyalty might be settled with a new clause. A request for specialized craftsmen could be granted, further intertwining the two economies. This correspondence reveals the Kadesh Treaty as a living document, a framework that could bend and adapt without breaking. It challenges our image of ancient pacts as rigid, unchanging stone carvings. They could evolve, much like a modern trade agreement is amended with new protocols. This dynamic system, however, relied entirely on the stability of the two powers that created it. The treaty's eventual slide into obscurity was sealed not just by the dramatic collapse of the Hittite Empire, but by the slow, grinding rise of new powers like Assyria. These emerging kingdoms had no memory of the great battle at Kadesh, no stake in the sacred oath sworn before 100 forgotten gods. To them, the treaty was a meaningless piece of parchment, a relic of a dead world with no bearing on their own ambitions. This is the common fate of so many ancient pacts. Their power dies with the context that gave them meaning. Seeing treaties as living instruments that breathe and change with their times completely reshapes our understanding of ancient statecraft. It prepares us to ask a crucial question as we look eastward. If the Egyptians and Hittites could manage their border with such nuance, how did the sprawling empires of Asia handle the same eternal problem of the frontier? A white horse was sacrificed to seal a pact between two worlds. For the Han dynasty, the vast northern frontier was not a line to be held, but a relationship to be managed. Their great adversary was the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation of nomadic tribes whose horse archers could strike without warning and vanish back into the steppe. The Great Wall was not an impenetrable barrier. It was a negotiating position made of stone and earth. The treaties they forged throughout the 2nd century before the Common Era were a delicate, often desperate, dance of diplomacy. The Han court, a sophisticated bureaucracy that recorded everything, faced an enemy whose power was measured in herds and mobility, not in written decrees. The core of their strategy was the Heqin system, a policy of marriage alliance. The Han emperor would send a princess of the imperial family, along with vast quantities of silk, grain, and luxury goods, to marry the Xiongnu Chanyu, or leader. This was not a simple wedding. It was a calculated act of statecraft, an attempt to transform a foreign chieftain into a son-in-law, binding him with familial obligation. The great historian Sima Qian documented these tense negotiations, revealing how the Han framed these tribute payments not as weakness, but as generous gifts from a superior civilization to a respectful subordinate. The reality, of course, was far more pragmatic. The Han were buying time and temporary security for their settled farmers. The treaties also meticulously defined grazing rights, creating a buffer zone north of the wall where Xiongnu herds could pasture. This was a profound admission that a border against a nomadic people could not be a simple line. It had to be a shared space, a recognized territory where their way of life could continue without triggering a raid. The most powerful moments in these negotiations were the rituals. The oath of the white horse was a solemn, bloody ceremony. A white horse, a sacred animal to the steppe peoples, was sacrificed. Its blood was smeared on the lips of the sworn brothers, the Han envoy and the Xiongnu Chanyu. They swore an oath of eternal peace, calling upon heaven and earth to witness their vow. This act fused legal obligation with deep spiritual power, speaking directly to the nomadic culture in a language it understood. Yet for all their symbolic weight, these treaties were inherently fragile. They were broken again and again. A harsh winter on the steppe would push desperate Xiongnu riders across the agreed boundary. A new, ambitious Chanyu would see the rich Han lands as a target, not a relation. The Heqin princesses, far from home, often found their influence limited. The cycle of treaty, raid, and renegotiation continued for decades until a decisive Han emperor, Wu, abandoned the strategy entirely. He launched massive, preemptive military campaigns deep into Xiongnu territory, seeking a final solution through sheer force. The treaties were forgotten, their specific terms lost to all but historians. But their legacy was indelible. They established a Chinese playbook for dealing with the steppe, a mix of kinship diplomacy, economic incentive, and ritual that would be used, adapted, and abandoned by every subsequent dynasty. This centuries-long struggle reveals a fundamental truth about borders. Against a settled empire, a border is a wall. Against a nomadic confederation, a border is a conversation, a constantly renegotiated understanding that can be shattered by a single drought or a change of leadership. This eternal challenge of the open frontier would soon be faced by an empire that believed its own borders were divinely ordained. That 50-year peace was purchased with Persian gold and Byzantine silk. After decades of brutal war that had exhausted both empires, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I and the Sasanian Persian King Khosrow I finally settled their differences in the year 562. The treaty they signed was a monument of late antique statecraft, a comprehensive agreement that fixed their contested border in Mesopotamia and the Caucasus for 2 generations. The chronicler Procopius recorded the immense cost to Constantinople, an annual tribute of 30,000 gold coins paid to Persia. This was not a sign of weakness but a cold calculation. Justinian needed to secure his eastern flank at any price. His true ambitions lay in the west, rebuilding the Roman Empire by reconquering Italy and North Africa from the Goths and Vandals. For Khosrow, the gold was essential to fortify his own northern frontiers against the relentless incursions of the White Huns and other steppe confederations. This treaty was diplomacy as strategic triage, allowing both empires to stop bleeding each other dry and turn to face more immediate existential threats. The clauses of the agreement were remarkably detailed, going far beyond a simple line on a map. It specified the status of key strategic forts, determining which ones would be garrisoned and which would be dismantled to create a demilitarized buffer zone. It meticulously regulated the movement of merchants, designating specific border crossings where trade could be conducted under strict supervision. This transformed a volatile war zone into a regulated economic corridor. Silk, spices, and glass now flowed along routes protected by the treaty itself, taxing the commerce that passed through and filling both imperial treasuries. Yet this sophisticated system required constant maintenance. The treaty was not a one-time event, but a living process. Minor disputes over caravan routes or the loyalty of a border chieftain demanded near constant renegotiation by envoys traveling between the two courts. The peace held not because the old rivals trusted each other, but because the agreement created a framework to manage their inevitable friction. Its eventual collapse was almost predictable. New emperors in Constantinople balked at the endless gold payments, seeing them as humiliating tribute rather than prudent strategy. A new, ambitious Shah in Persia saw a weakened Byzantium as a target for plunder, not a partner for peace. The carefully constructed border dissolved back into a battlefield within decades of Khosrow and Justinian's deaths. The treaty was forgotten, another casualty of shifting leadership and the relentless pressure of new enemies. But its ghost lingered. The specific borders it had defined, the trade routes it had legitimized, these became the baseline for every subsequent negotiation between the two empires for the next century. This forgotten pact demonstrates a profound truth about great power borders. They are not permanent victories, but temporary and expensive compromises, a lesson that would echo through the ages as we move from the world of late antiquity into the fragmented landscape of medieval Europe. Charlemagne's empire did not shatter from an outside invasion, but fractured from within by his own blood. The Treaty of Verdun, signed in the year 843, stands as one of the most decisive acts of political surgery in history. Three grandsons of the great emperor, Louis the German, Charles the Bald, and Lothair I, met to carve their grandfather's unified realm into three separate kingdoms. They were not just dividing land, they were drawing the rough blueprint for modern Europe. Charles received the western lands that would become the core of France. Louis took the eastern German-speaking territories, and Lothair was granted a long, precarious middle kingdom stretching from the North Sea down through Italy, a strip of land that included the symbolic capitals of Aachen and Rome. This was not a random division. Chroniclers like Nithard record that the brothers paid close attention to the languages spoken in different regions, attempting to follow the rough divide between Romance and Germanic tongues. They were, in a sense, trying to create nations based on a very early understanding of cultural identity. The treaty's structure followed Frankish inheritance customs, where a father's estate was divided equally among his sons. But as historian Rosamund McKitterick explains, this focus on equitable shares of revenue and land ignored the deeper, more stubborn regional loyalties that had existed long before Charlemagne. The men at Verdun were accountants splitting an asset, not architects building stable states. The most volatile creation was that Middle Kingdom, often called Lotharingia. It became a geopolitical nightmare, a long, thin territory with no natural defensible borders, coveted by its neighbors on both sides. The Alps and the Rhine River, intended as clear dividing lines, instead became permanent flashpoints. For centuries, the lands between France and Germany would be a bloody battleground, their ownership contested in war after war, their instability rooted directly in the decisions of 843. And then the treaty itself was forgotten. As France and Germany later forged their own powerful national identities, they looked back to different founding myths, to later kings and emperors. The moment their essential shapes were first carved out of a Frankish whole was buried under the weight of those later stories. The Treaty of Verdun demonstrates a profound and unsettling truth. The most enduring borders are not always the result of careful planning or cultural unity. Sometimes they are simply the temporary compromise between rival brothers, a family argument that accidentally sculpts the face of a continent for 1,000 years. A bishop's curse could be more terrifying than a king's army in the fractured landscape of 10th century Europe. As central authority crumbled and local lords waged endless private wars, the church stepped into the power vacuum with a radical idea. The Peace of God movement was a series of ecclesiastical decrees, beginning in France, that declared certain places and people immune from violence. Churches, monasteries, and the lands surrounding them became sacred borders, sanctuaries where even the most bitter rivals could not pursue their feuds. This was not a treaty between two rulers, but a universal pact imposed by divine authority. The chronicler Adema of Chabans documented massive outdoor gatherings where relics of saints were paraded before crowds of peasants and knights. In an electrifying spectacle of collective emotion, nobles were pressured to publicly swear oaths upon these holy relics, vowing to uphold the peace. To break such an oath was to risk eternal damnation, a spiritual sanction that held real power in a deeply religious society. This was border-making of a completely different kind. The line was not between two territories, but around a single, sacred space, rendering it an island of peace in a sea of conflict. The movement soon evolved into the Truce of God, which went even further by creating borders in time. It forbade all warfare from Wednesday evening until Monday morning, and during major religious festivals, effectively carving out more than half the year as off-limits for violence. As historian Thomas Head suggests, these movements did more than just protect the clergy and the poor. They planted a revolutionary seed in the medieval mind, the concept that some spaces and times should be universally beyond the reach of conflict. This idea of territorial immunity, forged in the fires of faith, would eventually migrate into the secular realm. We can see its distant echo in later treaties that designated neutral cities or demilitarized zones, spaces where the normal rules of war were suspended. The Peace of God itself was eventually overwhelmed by the re-emergence of strong monarchies, who claimed the sole right to declare war and make peace. Its decrees were forgotten, its public rituals faded into local folklore, yet its legacy asks a profound question that still resonates today. Can a border be drawn not by a state, but by a shared moral consensus? And if so, what does that tell us about the true foundations of peace? A princess in her library wrote the terms of a peace that would never come. The Treaty of Devol, signed in the year 1108, was a desperate attempt by the Byzantine Empire to impose order on the chaotic aftermath of the First Crusade. The Christian knights who had marched east to reclaim Jerusalem had ended up carving out their own independent states, and one of the most powerful was the Principality of Antioch, ruled by the ambitious Norman adventurer Bohemond of Taranto. From his court in Constantinople, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos saw these crusader lords not as allies, but as unpredictable rivals who had seized lands he considered his own. The treaty was his solution, a document of pure diplomatic force. Bohemond, recently defeated in his own war against the Byzantines, was forced to swear a solemn oath of fealty. He agreed to become the emperor's vassal, a man, acknowledging that Antioch and its surrounding territories were held as a gift from Constantinople. The treaty meticulously listed cities and forts that were to be returned to direct Byzantine control, drawing a new political map of the northern Levant with words and promises. We know the intimate details of these negotiations only because the emperor's daughter, Anna Komnene, immortalized them in her history, the Alexiad. She recorded the grand ceremony, the oaths sworn on holy relics, and the specific clauses that bound Bohemond to provide military support to the empire. The true complexity, however, lay not in the parchment but on the ground. Antioch was a crossroads world, a city where Latin church bells mingled with the chants of Greek Orthodox priests and the prayers of Armenian merchants. A border here was not a simple line between two cultures. It was a tangled web of overlapping loyalties. A local Armenian lord might pledge allegiance to a Norman knight one day and appeal to a Byzantine governor the next, whichever offered better protection or more gold. The treaty tried to legislate order into this fluid reality, but it created more ambiguity than it resolved. Who truly commanded the loyalty of a city's garrison if the man who paid them served a Norman prince, who in turn had sworn an oath to a Greek emperor? This inherent contradiction doomed the agreement from the start. As soon as Bohemond left the Levant, his nephew and successor, Tancred, simply refused to honor the terms. He argued that the oath was made under duress and held no power. Without a Byzantine army permanently stationed on his doorstep to enforce it, the treaty was just a collection of empty words. The meticulously drawn borders existed only in the imperial archives in Constantinople, a phantom map of what might have been. Yet, for all its failure, Devol set a crucial precedent. It established the Byzantine claim to suzerainty over the Crusader states as a legal principle, a claim that would be asserted and negotiated for the next 100 years. It proved that in a world of mixed populations and competing identities, a border drawn by a distant power was the most fragile thing of all. This struggle to impose clear lines on a blended world would soon be tested on an even grander scale, not between Christians, but at the fiery frontier of two global faiths. A royal wedding in 1386 stitched two nations together with threads of cloth and clauses of parchment. The Treaty of Windsor created a perpetual alliance between England and Portugal, a bond so durable it has never been broken. This was not a temporary ceasefire or a simple trade deal. It was a comprehensive pact of mutual military support and commercial privilege, sworn between King John I of Portugal and King Richard II of England. To seal the agreement, John married Philippa of Lancaster, the daughter of England's most powerful noble. This union wove the two royal families together, transforming a diplomatic understanding into a matter of familial loyalty. The treaty effectively drew a new border around the entire Iberian Peninsula, a diplomatic one that explicitly excluded other European powers like Castile and France from interfering in Portuguese affairs. England gained a reliable ally on the continent, a secure foothold from which to project influence, while Portugal secured its hard-won independence from its larger neighbors, freeing its resources to look outward toward the sea. As historian Peter Russell highlights, the treaty's genius was its flexibility. It was not a rigid set of rules carved in stone, but a living framework. For centuries, both nations have been able to reinterpret its terms to suit the needs of the moment, whether facing Napoleon's armies or navigating the complexities of the 20th century. This adaptability is the secret to its astonishing longevity, making it the oldest active alliance in the world, but its forgotten impact lies far from Europe's shores. During the age of exploration, this old friendship directly shaped the new borders of the world. The treaty provided the diplomatic backbone for the two nations as they carved up uncharted territories. English ships operating with the tacit blessing of their Portuguese allies could challenge Spanish dominance in the Caribbean. Portuguese explorers, secure in their alliance, could focus their efforts on charting the coast of Africa and establishing a sea route to India. The treaty created a stable, cooperative front that allowed both to compete more effectively against their shared rivals, Spain and France. The colonial maps of the Americas and Africa, with their spheres of influence and lines of demarcation, were indirectly drawn in the halls of Windsor. This enduring partnership proves that the most powerful borders are not always marked by walls or armies. They can be written in vows and trade agreements, creating alliances that quietly guide the pen across the world's map for centuries. That line of longitude was drawn through an ocean of the unknown. In 1494, with the New World looming suddenly on European maps, Spain and Portugal faced a problem of unprecedented scale. How could they divide lands that were still largely unexplored? The Treaty of Tordesillas was their breathtakingly ambitious answer, a single meridian set 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the east of this imaginary line belonged to Portugal, everything to the west to Spain. This was not just border-making, it was world-making, an attempt to carve up entire continents with a stroke of a pen, sanctioned by the Pope himself. The treaty was a direct result of Christopher Columbus's first voyage, which had immediately sparked a rivalry between the two Iberian powers. Both were eager to claim the vast wealth and souls they believed awaited them, and both wanted to avoid a costly war. The solution was to turn the Atlantic Ocean itself into a border, a concept that was as revolutionary as it was impractical. The core of the agreement was about rights, the exclusive right for Spain to explore and colonize to the west, and for Portugal to do the same to the east. It was a legal framework for conquest, a document that gave divine and royal permission to claim lands inhabited by millions of people who had no knowledge of its existence. As geographer Jerry Broughton emphasizes, the treaty was fraught with ambiguity from the very start. No one could agree on exactly where the line was because no one knew for certain how long a league was or how to accurately measure longitude at sea. This was like trying to divide a room by drawing a line through the fog. The most famous consequence of this vagueness was Brazil. When Portuguese explorers, following the currents, landed on the South American coast, they argued that this new territory lay east of the Tordesillas line. Through later diplomatic revisions, this claim was accepted, which is why the dominant language of Brazil is Portuguese today, a massive territorial fluke born from a cartographic guess. The treaty's true legacy, however, was the model it created. It established the European precedent that newly discovered lands could be divided by distant powers without any reference to the people already living there. This template of external imposition would be used again and again, from the scramble for Africa to the colonial partitions of Asia. We remember the treaty for its audacity, but we often forget its profound ignorance. It drew borders through deserts, mountains, and rainforests its authors could not even imagine, setting the stage for centuries of conflict and cultural erasure. This global division by fiat raises a disturbing question. When you draw a border in a place you have never seen, what are you truly dividing and what are you creating? A single signature in 1648 could erase a duke's ancient claim to a river valley. The Peace of Westphalia was not one treaty, but a sprawling collection of agreements signed in the cities of Münster and Osnabrück to end the 30 Years' War, a conflict so devastating it had depopulated entire regions of Central Europe. Its primary goal was to stop the bleeding, but its ultimate effect was to redraw the very concept of a border. Before Westphalia, political authority in Europe was a tangled web. A duke might owe allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor for some of his lands, but also hold a separate title granted by the Pope, while a city within his territory might claim independent status based on a charter from a long-dead king. It was a world of overlapping feudal rights and contested jurisdictions. The Westphalian treaties cut through this chaos with a radical new principle: territorial sovereignty. This meant that within its defined borders, a state held exclusive and final authority. No outside power, not even the emperor or the pope, could claim the right to interfere. This single idea transformed borders from fuzzy zones of shared influence into sharp, legal lines of absolute control. The Dutch Republic and the Swiss Confederation, after decades of struggle, were formally recognized as independent states, their borders confirmed and their sovereignty unchallenged. The Holy Roman Empire, once the theoretical master of Central Europe, was reduced to a hollow shell, its power now confined by the sovereign rights of the hundreds of principalities, bishoprics, and free cities within it. Legal scholar Leo Gross called this the Westphalian system, the very foundation of our modern international order. A border was no longer just a marker of where one king's army could march. It was the inviolable edge of a state's legal universe. This new system also created borders within states. A critical part of the peace was the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, which means whose realm, his religion. This allowed each prince within the empire to determine whether his territory would be officially Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist. Overnight, internal religious borders were drawn across Germany. A Protestant family living in a newly declared Catholic principality now faced a difficult choice: convert, leave, or live as a second-class citizen in their own home. This clause did not create tolerance in the modern sense, but it did organize religious difference into a territorial framework, freezing the religious map of Europe and influencing population patterns for centuries as people migrated to live under rulers of their own faith. Yet for all its foundational importance, the intricate reality of Westphalia has been smoothed over by time. We remember it as a single event that created sovereign states, forgetting the agonizingly specific negotiations over individual towns and fortresses. The treaties were a complex web of compromises that resolved some disputes while quietly planting the seeds for future conflicts, particularly in regions like Alsace, where vague wording would lead to wars centuries later. The peace did not spring from a pure desire for order, but from the exhausted realization that no single power could win. In resetting the continental boundaries, it demonstrated that the most enduring borders are often born not from victory, but from a shared and utter weariness. The ink dried at Zuhab in 1639, ending a century of slaughter between the Ottoman and Safavid empires. This was more than a peace, it was a grand division of the world along lines of faith and power. The treaty drew a rough but enduring line through the mountains of the Caucasus and the plains of Mesopotamia, a border that would harden over the centuries into one of the most stable in the region. The Ottoman Sultan Murad IV secured his prize, the fertile lands of Iraq, while the Safavid Shah Safi retained his hold on Azerbaijan. In the chronicles of the Ottoman scholar Katib Celebi, this was a moment of exhausted resolution. The real significance of Zuhab was its creation of a clear religious frontier. For the first time, the political border between the two empires came to closely mirror the great sectarian divide within Islam, separating the Sunni Ottoman realm from the Shia Safavid state. This was not just a line on a map, it was a cultural and spiritual rift given territorial form. Historian Rudi Matthi offers a crucial insight into why this particular border held when so many others failed. Both empires were distracted. The Ottomans were increasingly preoccupied with wars in Europe against the Habsburgs and with internal rebellions, while the Safavids faced growing pressure from nomadic tribes on their eastern frontiers and from the rising power of the Russian Tsardom to the north. With their attention and resources pulled elsewhere, neither side had the energy or will to restart their Mesopotamian war. This mutual exhaustion allowed the border to settle. Over decades and then centuries, the line established at Zuhab became normalized. Trade routes adapted to it, local governors administered up to its edge, and generations of people on both sides grew up knowing this as the permanent reality. The treaty itself was forgotten in European chanceries, a distant agreement from a world they barely understood. But its ghost never left the land. When the modern states of Iraq and Iran were formed in the 20th century, their diplomats did not start with a blank slate. They argued over a boundary whose basic contours had been first negotiated at Zuhab nearly 300 years earlier. The ancient imperial division, forged in religious conflict and cemented by geopolitical stalemate, became the foundation for a modern international border. How many of the lines on our maps today are just like this, the faded echoes of forgotten treaties between long-vanished empires? A river became the new border between two worlds at Nerchinsk. In 1689, deep in the Siberian wilderness, representatives of the King Emperor Kangxi and the Russian Tsar Peter the Great met to end a bloody conflict over the Amur River basin. This was not just a clash of armies, but a collision of empires with utterly different worldviews. The Russians, pushing eastward for furs and territory, had built forts on land the king considered their ancestral domain. The resulting treaty was a landmark achievement, the first formal agreement between China and a European power. What made it even more remarkable was the table of negotiation itself. Jesuit missionaries, acting as interpreters, bridged the linguistic and cultural chasm between the Manchu and Russian delegations. The final document was recorded in 4 languages: Latin, Manchu, Russian, and Mongolian, a testament to the complex, multicultural reality of this distant frontier. The treaty did not attempt to draw a perfectly straight line. Instead, it wisely used the natural geography of the region, following the Argun River and the peaks of the Stanovoy Mountains to define the spheres of influence. This was a border designed for the real world, not for a mapmaker's dream. As historian Mark Mancall points out, this pragmatic approach created a vast buffer zone, a territory that acknowledged the seasonal movements of nomadic tribes like the Mongols, whose herds and loyalties did not conform to rigid political lines. For the king, this was a strategic victory that secured their northern flank. For Russia, it was a compromise that protected their lucrative fur trade and gave them a stable border, allowing them to consolidate their Siberian gains. The treaty's core principle that rivers and mountains make for stable and understandable frontiers would influence the mapping of the region for generations. Yet the story of Nerchinsk is largely forgotten, overshadowed by the later treaties of Heqin and Beijing in the 19th century, which pushed the border further south and are remembered for their imposed inequality. Nerchinsk stands apart as a rare moment of relative balance, a demonstration that even the most different empires could find a compromise when exhaustion and mutual interest outweighed the desire for conquest. This early success in East-West diplomacy makes you wonder how many other moments of pragmatic peace have been lost to the louder narrative of war. a single signature in Utrecht could echo from the Mediterranean to the shores of North America. The treaty signed in 1713 was the centerpiece of a sprawling peace settlement that ended the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that had engulfed Europe and its empires. But its true legacy was not just in ending a war. It was in the deliberate, almost surgical way it redrew the world map to create a new kind of stability. The agreement involved a dozen powers, from France and Spain to Britain and the Dutch Republic, and its territorial clauses were a grand exercise in geopolitical engineering. The British Crown gained the rocky fortress of Gibraltar, a seemingly small prize that gave it permanent control over the gateway between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Spain, while seeing its European territories partitioned, had its control over its vast American colonies formally recognized by the other powers, freezing the colonial map of the New World for a generation. In Europe, territories like Sicily and Sardinia were swapped between Austrian and Spanish rulers like pieces on a chessboard, each move calculated to ensure no single nation could become too dominant. This was the birth of the balance of power as a formal diplomatic doctrine, an attempt to prevent future wars by carefully calibrating the gains and losses of every major state. As international relations scholar Heinz Dutchard notes, the treaty established crucial precedents, emphasizing legal title and compensation over the raw right of conquest. A kingdom could not simply be seized, it had to be legally transferred, its value offset by another territory elsewhere. This introduced a new layer of order, however fragile, into international relations. Yet the sheer complexity of Utrecht has been smoothed over by time. In British history, it is remembered for Gibraltar. In Spanish history, it is a moment of loss. We forget how its tendrils reached into every corner of the globe. The treaty's clauses quietly reshaped imperial rivalries in the Americas and India, granting Britain the asiento, the contract to supply enslaved people to Spanish colonies, which in turn gave its merchants a foothold in closed Spanish markets. This single economic right, buried in the text, had a profound human cost and set the stage for decades of commercial competition. The treaty's greatest success was also its hidden flaw. It tried to create a static balance in a dynamic world. The careful calibration of 1713 could not account for the rising power of Prussia or the economic explosion of Britain's colonial projects. It asked us to consider a world where borders were not just lines of control, but weights on a scale constantly adjusted to keep the peace. But what happens when the scale itself begins to change? That global rearrangement reached its zenith in 1763, when a single treaty reshaped the destiny of an entire continent. The Treaty of Paris was the grand finale to the 7 Years' War, a conflict so vast it was truly the First World War. In the gilded halls of negotiation, British and French diplomats like the Duc de Choiseul traded territories like playing cards on a global board. France ceded Canada, its vast North American heartland, to Britain. In a separate but simultaneous move, France secretly handed the massive territory of Louisiana to its ally Spain as compensation. With a few signatures, the map of North America was redrawn. The French flag, which had flown from Quebec to New Orleans, was suddenly gone from the continent. This was more than a simple land swap. It was a tectonic shift in imperial power. But the treaty's text reveals a far more nuanced story than a simple victory for Britain. The negotiators argued endlessly over tiny islands off the coast of Newfoundland. Why? Because of cod, fishing rights in the Grand Banks were a point of fierce contention, a recognition that a border was not just about land, but about the wealth that lay in the sea. The treaty also contained clauses protecting the rights of the Catholic French-speaking population, now under British rule in Canada. This was a rare, early acknowledgement that a border crossing a people did not have to erase their culture. Yet, as historian Fred Anderson powerfully argues, the treaty had a colossal blind spot. It completely ignored the claims and alliances of the Native American nations who lived on these transferred lands. The document treated North America as an empty chessboard for European kings to divide, but it was a crowded, complex world of its own. By failing to even mention the indigenous peoples, the treaty guaranteed that the new frontier would not be one of peace, but of relentless violence. The British Proclamation Line of 1763, an attempt to draw a boundary between colonial settlement and native lands, was a direct and failed response to this oversight. This forgotten flaw in the Paris Agreement lit the fuse for decades of brutal conflict on the Appalachian frontier. We remember the treaty for creating a British North America, but we forget the specific boundaries it quibbled over, the tiny islands and fishing rocks that were so vital to the men who signed it. Its grand territorial drama has been buried by the American Revolution it helped to spark. This final great pact of the Old World shows us the ultimate ambition and the ultimate limitation of drawing borders from thousands of miles away. A war that changed almost nothing on the map created one of the world's most peaceful borders. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve 1814, officially ended the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain. After years of fighting, the burning of capitals and naval battles on the Great Lakes, the most remarkable thing about the treaty was its central clause. It called for a return to the status quo ante bellum, meaning everything went back to exactly how it was before the war started. The same vague, contested borders between the United States and British Canada were reinstated as if the conflict had never happened. On the surface, it appeared to be a diplomatic failure, a simple reset button pressed after immense cost. But hidden within its text was a revolutionary seed, a single article that would prove far more important than the peace itself. This was the creation of joint boundary commissions. The treaty mandated that teams of surveyors, astronomers, and cartographers from both nations would be appointed to map the entire frontier with scientific precision from the St. Lawrence River to the Lake of the Woods. For the first time, the border would not be a line described in vague 18th century prose, but a clear, mutually agreed upon line of latitude and longitude, physically marked on the land with stone monuments and clear cuts through the forests. This was diplomacy by map and compass, a commitment to replace ambiguity with exactitude. Legal scholar John Bassett Moore later praised this mechanism as a masterstroke of practical statecraft. The commissions did not work quickly. They toiled for decades, patiently resolving disputes over islands in the Passamaquoddy Bay and navigating the intricate geography of the Great Lakes. Each agreed upon map, each settled island, was a small victory that built trust and made future conflict over that particular piece of territory unthinkable. This slow, technical, and utterly unglamorous work transformed a volatile war zone into the world's longest undefended border. We remember the war for its battles and its national myths, but we forget the quiet, persistent diplomacy that followed. The Treaty of Ghent's true legacy is not that it ended a war, but that it built a system to prevent the next one. It proved that the most enduring peace is not dictated from a negotiation table, but is painstakingly surveyed mile by mile across the very land it protects. These 21 treaties were far more than forgotten footnotes. They were the chisels that carved our continents and the pens that defined our civilizations. From the sacred oaths sworn before the gods at Kadesh to the patient surveyors marking the Canadian border after Ghent, each agreement reveals a fundamental truth about humanity. We have always sought to impose order on a chaotic world, using negotiation, compromise, and sometimes overwhelming force to draw lines that we hope will hold. The borders we see on our maps today, the lines we cross so casually, are not permanent features of the earth. They are the accumulated result of countless such pacts, most of them now lost to memory. History is a palimpsest, a manuscript where older writings still show through beneath the surface. The choices made by Rameses and Chandragupta, by the grandsons of Charlemagne and the diplomats at Utrecht, are still faintly visible in the political landscape of our modern world. So the next time you look at a map, try to see beyond the modern names and bold colors. Look for the deep histories embedded in every boundary line, the echoes of ancient promises and forgotten conflicts. We would love to hear which of these treaties surprised you the most. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden forces that shaped our world, subscribe for more explorations. And carry with you this final insight, that even the most obscure and forgotten agreements can hold profound lessons for the global challenges we face.